we human beings are scared to death of death. And understandably so. There's nothing pleasant about death, and there's nothing that we can do about it. And so modern man and modern woman has developed myriad ways of coping with our mortality. But our primary defense mechanism against death is pretty much just ignoring it completely. In our day-to-day lives, we busy ourselves with diversions to avoid the discomfort of facing the ever-present reality that we are finite creatures. And this is probably for the best. After all, we wouldn't accomplish much as individuals or species if we were constantly aware and living in constant dread of our own demise. But though we desperately seek to ignore the reality of death, we can never fully escape. We are often reminded of death, usually, if not exclusively, by the dying. For much of human history, it was natural for the dying and the living to share space. But contemporary American life, perhaps in part because of our discomfort and fear of death, has done much to separate the dying from the living, and thus spare us, the living, from the unpleasantness of being reminded of our own impermanence. Decades and centuries ago, the most common place for a natural death to occur was the home, surrounded by one's family, including children and grandchildren. Upon death, an undertaker would actually come to the home and perform the embalming in the kitchen or the bedroom. Funeral rites occurred in the parlor, where mourners would gather to pay their respects and take pictures. It was common practice for the dead to be dressed and propped up and photographed one last time, sitting next to friends and family. Death was such a normal, natural part of the home life of the Victorian era that superstitions began cropping up among families, superstitions which guided their interactions with the recently deceased. For example, it was common practice for families to stop all the clocks in the house at the exact moment of death, and then only restart them after the burial. After a family member died, mirrors were covered with black cloth so as to keep the deceased's spirit from entering the mirrors and remaining in the home. And when it was time for burial, the body of the deceased was always carried out feet first, because if the body left head first, the spirit in the body might see the house over his toes as he was being carried away, and thus be tempted to return and haunt the inhabitants. Cemeteries used to be primarily on church ground, thus allowing and encouraging family members to visit the graves of loved ones every Sunday. And non-church cemeteries were often placed in parks. They were actually designed to be places of exploration and play for the entire family. But modernity changed all of that. With the modern age, we began to segregate, to ghettoize the dead and the dying. Dying at home has now become the exception rather than the rule. Last year, over 70% of deaths in America occurred in a hospital, nursing home, or long-term care facility. Home embalmings and funerals began being replaced by professional funeral homes in the 1940s. Church and park cemeteries gave way to lonesome graveyards, often situated far away from the centers of social activity. And here is perhaps my favorite example of how modernity sought to distance us from and change our attitudes about death. Recall that funerals used to be held in the large front room of the house known as the parlor. In the early part of the 20th century, following World War I and a particularly virulent outbreak of influenza, the home parlor picked up a nickname. People began referring to it as the death room. After the war ended, after the flu ran its course and there weren't quite so many dead to attend to, the Ladies' Home Journal suggested that it was time for these rooms to be repurposed and rebranded. And so it is because of the Ladies' Home Journal that death rooms became living rooms. Prior to the modern age, we were well acquainted with death. While never welcomed, death certainly was no stranger. Death was simply a natural part of life. But now, we have succeeded in separating ourselves from death, from the dead and the dying, to an extent never before seen in human history. Baby boomers were probably the first generation to experience death more often through fiction than reality. I challenge you to consider this. Over the course of your life, compare the number of real, actual deaths or funerals you have witnessed versus the number of fictional deaths or funerals you have seen depicted in theater, television, and movies. Think about how staggering that ratio is. Then think about how death is usually represented through these mediums. Often TV and movies dramatize, valorize, romanticize death. Death on TV and movies is accompanied by soft lighting, great, swelling, evocative music, beautifully poignant final words spoken softly to a loved one. And of course, no fictive medium can ever fully capture what follows that death for those who grieve. The lingering emptiness, the absence, the hole. Death, where is thy sting? It has been stolen by Hollywood. We modern human beings are quite ingenious when it comes to finding ways to avoid the unpleasant reality of mortality. So why am I talking so much about death on Easter Sunday, a day that is supposed to be a celebration of rebirth, resurrection, and new life? Because just as there can be no Fat Tuesday without Ash Wednesday, there can be no Easter Sunday without Good Friday. There can be no new life without first a burial. There can be no resurrection without first a crucifixion. If we gloss over the darkness in our rush to embrace the light, if we forsake and forget the agony in the garden, the betrayal, the torture, the death, while we put on our Sunday best, hide our plastic eggs, and bask in the glow of an inspirational sermon designed to fill our hearts with hope, then we become complicit to modernity's forced segregation of death from life. As this congregation's minister, I think it my responsibility, my obligation, and my duty to disallow the cup of suffering to pass from us before we have all had a good long drink. So before we give our attention over to the beauty and the hope of Easter and the new life that it represents, let us first embrace the agony, the suffering, and the struggle that must precede. Let us reckon with our mortality. Let us attempt to make peace with our end. This morning, I am going to invite all of us to engage in a bit of a thought experiment. This will be familiar territory for some of us, and that is to be expected in a congregation full of people with a diversity of beliefs regarding what happens to us after we die. We, as UUs, we embrace and celebrate that diversity, knowing it is a defining element of who we are as a religious community. But for right now, I would like to invite all of us to lean into our fear and discomfort. And for a moment, I'm going to ask you to consider and fully contemplate your end. And I'm going to ask you in a moment to think of it as a true and final end, a terminality with no hereafter, the end with no epilogue, no sequel. If that were to be the final truth of our reality, what would it mean to you? How would acceptance or acknowledgement of that possible truth, how might that change the way you are living now? What meaning would it give to your life? What meaning would it take away? I'll give us a few moments now to sit in silence and ponder those questions. As we together move out of that place, reflect on how you feel right now. Are you filled with peace, anxiety, despair? Did the experience serve to disconnect you from your community, from humankind? Did it tempt you to believe that without a heaven or a hell, without a karmic cycle, all is permissible? And you should therefore take what you can, that is, all that you can without getting caught? Or did the experience draw you closer to your brothers and sisters seated here today? Did it strengthen and tighten the bonds that connect you one to another? In your reflection, I wonder if you recognize that all of us are not but stardust wrapped in mud and ash, and that our shared mortality, our shared frailty, is the common denominator that binds all of us together as one. Musing on your own end can lead us into one of two possible directions. On the one hand, it can lead us to isolation, selfishness, and moral anarchy. Or it can lead us to empathy, a recognition that we are a unity, and a joyful embracing of the moral responsibilities we owe to one another, because at our core, we are all one. I'm struck by this quote by author and poet Charles Bukowski. We're all going to die. All of us. What a circus. That alone should make us love each other, but it doesn't. We are terrorized and flattened by trivialities. We are eaten up by nothing. Trivialities and nothings. Bukowski reminds us that as a species, we ignore death at our own peril. He reminds us that there is immense value in taking time to reflect upon our mortality, a mortality we share with each and every member of the human family. And when we all recognize that, we can, at the very least, be afraid together, despair together, live in gratitude for the precious fleeting gift of life that we share together, and thus love one another better. And now that we have struggled a bit with death, now are we prepared to struggle with life? It is Easter, after all. I would like to invite all of you to engage in one more thought experiment this morning. Whatever your actual belief about what happens or doesn't happen to us after death, for this moment, I would like you to give yourself permission to believe with certainty that there is something more. Imagine and accept for a moment that in this universe full of astronomical improbabilities and miracles, that there is one last surprise waiting for each of us. And for our purposes right now, that final miracle can express itself in whatever fashion makes the most sense to you. A physical resurrection, a heaven of disembodied spirits, reincarnation into a new life, nirvana, other, perhaps some utterly indescribable, unfathomable return to the ineffable source of all. As we enter that place, consider, ask yourself, what would that mean to you? How would acceptance or acknowledgement of that possible truth, how might that change the way you are living now? What meaning might it give to your life? What meaning might it take away? As we together move out of that place, reflect on how you feel. Are you filled with peace, hope, curiosity? Did the experience draw you closer to your brothers and sisters here, reminding you that we are all children of the same divine source? Or did that experience disconnect you? Did it tempt you to believe that in light of eternity, anything that happens on this temporal plane, actions and inactions both, are utterly irrelevant? Did it perhaps tempt you into believing that we have no real responsibility to mold this present world into the shape of love and justice? Much like our musing on a final end, these ponderings, based on a belief in the hereafter, can also lead us in one of two directions. The same two directions as before. Will you respond with empathy, a recognition of our oneness, and a joyful embrace of our moral responsibilities to one another? Or will you respond with isolation, selfishness, and destruction? It is exceedingly sad, tragic, that we live in a world where certain fundamentalistic beliefs about the nature of the hereafter, often linked to narrow readings of sacred text, have inspired horrific acts of violence and terror. From Belgium to France, to Syria and Iraq, to the Ivory Coast and Nigeria, to Charleston, South Carolina, and Colorado Springs. Instead of recognizing that our frailty, our fragility, and our mortality bind us all together, instead of being drawn together in gratitude for the beautiful and fragile gift of life that we all share, instead of acknowledging that we are all stardust, sparks shot forth from the same divine source, instead of all that, humankind has often chosen to allow trivialities and nothings to divide and destroy us. But on this Easter Sunday, I am here to tell you that there is hope. There is a new life available to each and every one of us, and it's available to us here and now. It is a life that minimizes the trivialities and the nothings. It is a life that truly celebrates the inherent worth and dignity of all people. It is a life in which we joyfully take up our cross and embrace the moral responsibilities that come with recognizing our role in this vast, vast universe of interconnections and interdependencies. It is a life where, in spite of our fear, we will take courage and drink deeply from the cup of sorrows, secure in the knowledge that we will have the strength to endure. It is a life of sacred community, beloved community, where together we will face and overcome our fear of death and replace it with a peace that passes all understanding. It is a life of never-ending, unceasing, inexorable hope. As we prepare to close our worship this Easter morning, I'd like to bless us with these words from Anne Frank. It's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness, and I hear every approaching thunder which will destroy us too. I can feel the suffering of millions. And yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think it will all come right, and that this cruelty too will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. In the meantime, I must uphold my ideals, for perhaps the time will come when I shall be able to carry them out. Like Anne, may we never lose faith that in spite of so much evidence to the contrary, people are good. Like Anne, may we see the encroaching wilderness, hear the approaching thunder, feel the suffering of the millions. And like Anne, may we never let go of the hope that if we hold fast to our deepest ideals, all will come right. Cruelty will end, and peace will return. Blessed be, and happy Easter.